Betu adjusted her school bag on her shoulder as she walked down the dusty road to her best friend Kassa's house. It was a sunny afternoon in the small township outside Durban, and Betu, at 16, was filled with the usual concerns of a teenage girl: school assignments, friendship dramas, and the dreams of becoming someone great someday. Kassa had been her confidant since they were children, and Betu often escaped her busy household to spend hours at Kassa's home. When she knocked on the wooden door of Kassa's modest house, Kassa's father, Mr. Dlamini, opened it. A tall, imposing man in his late 40s, he greeted her with a wide smile that seemed unusually warm. "Kassa's just in her room," he said, stepping aside. "Come in, Betu." She stepped inside, her shoes scuffing against the tiled floor. The house was unusually quiet, the only sound coming from the hum of a distant radio. She glanced toward Kassa's room but saw no light under the door. "She's in there?" Betu asked, her voice uncertain. "She'll be out in a minute," Mr. Dlamini replied, closing the door behind her. The click of the lock sent a chill down her spine. Turning toward him, she opened her mouth to ask what was going on, but before she could speak, he grabbed her wrist with startling force. What are you doing?" she stammered, panic setting in as his grip tightened. His smile was gone, replaced by a predatory look. "Kassa isn't home," he said, his voice low and chilling. The air seemed to leave the room. Betu's heart raced as she tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. "Please, let me go," she pleaded, her voice trembling. He said nothing, dragging her toward the couch in the living room. Her legs felt like lead as fear paralyzed her. The room seemed to close in around her, walls shrinking, air thickening. When he pushed her onto the couch, she screamed, but he quickly covered her mouth with his hand. "Quiet," he hissed. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled against his weight. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to fight, but he was too strong. The assault was brutal and dehumanizing. Betu felt as though her soul had left her body, hovering above as she endured the unimaginable. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, every second a lifetime of pain and shame. When it was over, she lay motionless, staring blankly at the ceiling. Mr. Dlamini stood, adjusting his clothes as though nothing had happened. "Say anything," he warned, his voice cold and unfeeling, "and no one will believe you." Betu didn't respond. She couldn't. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. Betu didn't tell a soul, not Kassa, not her mother, not even Ajumby, her cousin who was like a sister to her. She carried the secret like a heavy stone in her chest, its weight growing heavier with each passing day. Months later, when she missed her period and her belly began to swell, she realized she was pregnant. Panic coursed through her veins, but the shame and fear of being disbelieved kept her silent. She began wearing oversized hoodies and baggy skirts, hiding her growing belly under layers of clothing. At home, she avoided her mother's scrutinizing gaze, staying out late and pretending to be busy with schoolwork. Her mother, a stern but loving woman, often commented on how much she'd been eating lately. "Betu, you're gaining weight," she'd say, narrowing her eyes. "Are you eating at Kassa's house too?" Betu would laugh nervously and change the subject. Ajumby, 28 and childless after years of trying, often visited. She adored Betu, treating her like the little sister she'd never had. "You've been quiet lately," Ajumby said one evening as they sat on the porch. "Is everything okay?" Betu nodded quickly, avoiding her cousin's probing eyes. "Just school stress," she mumbled. When the time came, Betu had no plan. Labor pains hit her in the middle of the night, and she slipped out of the house, clutching her stomach. She made her way to an abandoned shed behind Ajumby's house, biting down on her cries of pain to avoid waking the neighbors. Hours later, she gave birth to a baby girl. Exhausted and trembling, she held the tiny, squirming infant in her arms, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what to do, but knew she couldn't keep the baby. As dawn broke, she knocked on Ajumby's door, the baby wrapped in a thin blanket. "Ajumby," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "I need your help." Ajumby gasped when she saw the baby. "Betu, what? How?" "Please," Betu interrupted, her voice breaking. "Take her. She's yours." Ajumby, though shocked, agreed to raise the baby as her own. She named the child Zinhle, meaning beautiful. Betu, relieved but heartbroken, threw herself into helping raise her daughter, who grew up believing Ajumby was her mother and Betu her doting cousin. Betu's love for Zinhle was boundless. She spent hours teaching her to walk, read, and braid her hair. She attended school events, cheered at sports days, and comforted Zinhle when she was sick. But every moment was bittersweet. She watched from the sidelines as Ajumby received the hugs, the drawings, the whispered "I love yous" that Betu longed to claim for herself. Years passed and Zinhle grew into a bright, curious child. One day, as Betu helped her with homework, Zinhle looked up and asked, "Why don't you have children of your own, Betu?" But the weight of her secret grew heavier with each passing year. One afternoon, as Zinhle turned 10, she sat on the stoop outside Betu's house, playing with a necklace Ajumby had given her. The golden chain sparkled in the sunlight, and she looked up at Betu, her dark eyes filled with curiosity. "Auntie Betu," she asked, "why do you never stay with us for long? You always go back to your house when it gets dark. Don't you like being with us?" Betu's heart ached. She knelt before Zinhle, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Oh, Zinhle, I love being with you, more than anything in the world." "Then why don't you stay?" Zinhle pressed, her small voice full of innocence. Betu hesitated, her throat tight. "Because I think it's important for Mama and you to have your own special time together," she said finally. "But I'll always be right next door if you need me." Zinhle smiled and hugged her, not knowing how much those simple words meant to Betu. But the conversation planted a seed of doubt in Zinhle's mind, one that would grow as she got older. As Zinhle entered her teenage years, she began noticing things that didn't quite add up. She found photos tucked away in drawers, pictures of Betu holding her as a baby, her face radiating a love that felt different from a typical aunt's. One evening, Zinhle overheard a whispered conversation between her mother and Betu. "She's asking more questions," Ajumby said, her tone tinged with worry. "She's smart," Betu replied softly. "It was bound to happen." Zinhle's heart raced as she pressed her ear to the door. What were they hiding from her? The once simple dynamics of her family now seemed like a tangled web, and she was determined to unravel it. The past has a way of catching up when least expected. One day, as Zinhle walked home from school, she ran into Mr. Dlamini, the man Betu had avoided for years. He was older now, his face lined with age, but his presence was no less sinister. "Hello there," he said, his voice smooth yet unsettling. "You must be Zinhle. You look just like your aunt." Zinhle frowned. "You know my Aunt Betu?" Mr. Dlamini chuckled, his smile sending a chill down her spine. "Oh, I know her well. Tell her I said hello." When Zinhle mentioned the encounter to Betu, she froze. The color drained from her face, and her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "What did he say to you?" Betu demanded, her voice sharp. "Nothing really," Zinhle said, confused by Betu's reaction. "Just that I look like you." Betu's eyes filled with fear, and she stood abruptly, pacing the room. Zinhle had never seen her so upset. That night, Betu sat in her small bedroom, staring at a faded photograph of Zinhle as a baby. The past she had fought so hard to bury was beginning to resurface, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep it hidden. The breaking point came on Zinhle's 16th birthday. As the family gathered to celebrate, Zinhle confronted Ajumby after overhearing another cryptic conversation between her mother and Betu. Finally, Betu stepped forward. "Zinhle," she said, her voice trembling, "it's time you knew the truth." The room fell silent as Betu told Zinhle everything, the assault, the pregnancy, and the decision to let Ajumby raise her. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, her voice breaking under the weight of years of silence and pain. Zinhle sat in stunned silence, her world unraveling. You're my mother," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Days passed, and Zinhle avoided both Betu and Ajumby, staying with a friend while she processed the revelation. She felt betrayed, but deep down, she also felt a glimmer of understanding. Betu's sacrifice and Ajumby's love were undeniable, even if their choices had hurt her. One evening, Zinhle returned home and found Betu sitting on the porch, her face etched with worry. Without a word, Zinhle sat beside her. "I don't know how to feel," Zinhle admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm angry, but I also see how much you love me." Betu turned to her, tears in her eyes. "I love you more than anything, Zinhle. I made mistakes, but every choice I made was to give you the best life I could." Zinhle looked at her for a long moment before leaning into her embrace. For the first time, she called her Mama. The family began the slow process of healing. Zinhle started to understand the complexity of Betu's choices and found herself appreciating both her mother and Ajumby for the roles they had played in her life. Betu became more open about her past, sharing her story to help others heal. Zinhle, inspired by her mother's strength, began volunteering at a local women's shelter, determined to make a difference. Though the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined their future. Together, they began writing a new chapter, one of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family.